Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the American Academy of Pediatrics and HealthyChildren.org. Today we're discussing back to school for quirky kids and how to ease the transition to in-person learning. A few pieces of housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, so if you lose connectivity for any reason, you will be able to watch and listen to the archived webinar in a week or two on our website. If we can help you with any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat function to send us a message. Now, many of you submitted great questions during registration. Thank you. If you'd like to submit a question during the presentation, you can. Just use the chat function. You can activate chat by clicking on the speech bubble at the bottom center of your screen, or the person-shaped icon for mobile users. You can send in your questions at any time, and our hosts will get to as many as they can at the end of the presentation. Finally, we will soon draw the names of the 10 winners who will receive a copy of Quirky Kids, Understanding and Supporting Your Child with Developmental Differences, co-authored by today's hosts. We will announce the winners at the end of the presentation via the chat box, so keep an eye out for that. Winners will also be notified via email. We're excited to introduce our hosts, Dr. Perri Klass and Dr. Eileen Costello. Dr. Klass writes the weekly column, The Checkup, for the New York Times. She is Professor of Journalism and Pediatrics at New York University, practices pediatrics at Bellevue Hospital, and is the National Medical Director of the Reach Out and Read program. She is the author of numerous books, including Every Mother is a Daughter, The Never-Ending Quest for Success, Inner Peace, and A Really Clean Kitchen, which she co-authored with her mother. She also wrote Treatment, Kind and Fair, Letters to a Young Doctor. She is a mother of 3 and lives in New York City. Dr. Costello is a clinical professor of pediatrics at Boston University School of Medicine and the chief of ambulatory pediatrics at Boston Medical Center. She directs the Pediatric Primary Care Clinic and is medical director of the SOFAR, which is for Supporting Our Families Through Addiction and Recovery program for children of mothers with substance use disorders. She is also the mother of 3 and lives in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. Welcome, Drs. Klass and Costello.
Thank you. We're delighted to be here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you also for the wonderful questions that many of you sent in, some of which we're going to try to cover in our presentation and others which we'll come to at the end. We're going to start with the question of what we mean by quirky when we talk about quirky children in the book that we wrote and in today's presentation as we think about back to school.
So the word quirky is a word that sort of occurred to Perri and to me when we were first in practice together many years ago. We were taking care of kids in primary care and realized that there was a cohort of kids that were really just different, developmentally different than the other kids that we were taking care of. And we affectionately termed them the quirky kids in our practice. So what we mean by that is kids who may or may not meet criteria for a given diagnosis. For example, they may be somewhere along the autism spectrum. They may have nonverbal learning disability, social anxiety, ADHD, and other learning or developmental differences. They're the kids who do not follow the what to expect when you're expecting, or what to expect, developmentally in the first years of a child's life.
And some of these are kids who, as they grow up, either get assigned more than one diagnosis or seem to kind of ping pong from one worry to another. Is it an attention problem? Is it a learning issue? Is it something to do with being on the autism spectrum? They're the kids who are just not doing what is predicted on the developmental charts. And as we thought about this group of kids, we thought that it might be helpful for parents, instead of thinking in those diagnostic categories, to think about what some of the common challenges are for the children, for their families, for their teachers, and try to address the day-to-day issues. So, for example, a lot of these kids are rigid in their thinking. They don't find it easy to encompass change, to make transitions, and they're not necessarily extremely flexible. We're going to talk about some of those issues and how they come up around school. We're also going to talk about some of the mental health issues that come up, and probably most especially in this context about anxiety. So what happens when quirky kids go to school? What are some of the issues which come up for them, for their families, for their teachers, and for their classmates?
So the vast majority of kids that Perri and I follow in our practices who kind of fit under the umbrella of quirky kids are on an individual education plan in school, an IEP. Sometimes for learning differences or attention, sometimes for social or emotional reasons. Sometimes their behavior is challenging. Sometimes they have motor issues or occupational therapy types of issues. The one thing that most of our kids that we're discussing today have in common is difficulties with social interactions, with understanding the sort of hidden curriculum of school, expectations that may be explicit but are often implicit. Like, for example, you don't bring a water bottle into class. That's a rule, but no one ever said it, but suddenly, you're getting in trouble because you did. What kind of services do they receive? Probably the single most common is speech and language or pragmatic language therapy, but many kids also receive physical therapy, occupational therapy, some kind of psychotherapy or coaching about social skills, executive function, and that sort of thing.
And the fact that they do get these services in many cases through school has obviously had a profound impact on many of these kids over the past year and a half. And it's part of what we're going to talk about today is what's been interrupted, what have parents been able to maintain. Most of these kids are in integrated classrooms with kids who are more typically developing. They do, as Eileen was saying, have a lot of social issues, which in some cases means these are kids who had problems with bullying, problems with social exclusion. But and again, we'll come back to what that's meant for them over the past year and a half. There are a lot of these kids. They're in every public school. Some of them attend specialized private schools, which are specially designed for kids in some of these categories. But there are plenty of school issues, even in normal times. And as we know, these have not been normal times.
That's for sure. So how have quirky kids done academically over the past year? Start.
Yeah, well, one thing that you hear over and over again is that the kids in this group are by and large not the independent learners, not the ones who, if school went remote, this kid could sort of take the laptop and just work. And one of the things that we've heard over and over again from parents is that these were the kids where the parent ended up having to be there, having to be involved every step of the way, sometimes having to sit there with the child while the child was doing remote learning. And then the second piece, which follows from what we were just saying, is it wasn't just the academic life of these children that was disrupted. It was all of those other services that they received in school, which, depending on the school system, depending on the individual child and the individual's child's needs, some could be provided remotely, some could be partially provided remotely, some were getting some services in person. But this was a group of children for whom the pandemic meant interruption in the classroom learning, but also in these other services, which are really important to many of them. The other thing we might want to say about them is that a lot of these kids, for the reasons that we've been talking about in terms of their social issues, they're kids who in many cases rely on school for their social interactions. School offered a sort of programmed way to be with peers, which for some of them was hard to do in any other fashion. So that brings us to the question of how this group of children has done socially and emotionally over the past year. And maybe before we get to any of this, we ought to make it clear this has been a hard year for everyone, for all families, and parents have been heroic. Parents have had to cope with things that nobody's ever asked parents to cope with before in complicated and pressured circumstances with emotional overtones for the children, with economic overtones for families. And we want to recognize what parents, and especially maybe parents of quirky kids, have been dealing with, and think about how we can offer some guidelines and help for what's coming next.
I think as pediatricians, we have had a sort of, a really intimate window into the lives of families with young kids, and what an unbelievable struggle this last year and a half has been for so many of them. And I think for quirky kids, like all kids, how they've done socially and emotionally over the last year is kind of all over the map. For some kids, they've actually thrived. It has been a total and utter relief not to have to go to school. Kids with social anxiety, they preferred being home, although that was not always true for their parents, but for the kids, they were more comfortable with on-screen learning than doing it in person, especially kids who have been bullied or harassed at school because of being different. It was frankly a relief to them to not have to go to school. That, of course, is not true for everybody, but it was true for a subset of quirky kids.
And then, of course, for other kids, the isolation, the anxiety, the interruptions made it a very hard, very needy, very problematic year. And when we talk about how kids did over this past year, we also should recognize that the hardest hit communities in the pandemic have been Black and Hispanic communities, poor communities, economically disadvantaged families, all of the less highly resourced communities and less privileged communities. And that has also been true when you look at the ways that what different schools were able to provide during the pandemic.
Yeah, in my practice at Boston Medical Center, where the vast majority of our patients go to the Boston Public Schools, they were not open. Most kids were doing remote learning from home, which meant that one of their parents had to be home, which, often was the mother. And I think the impact of the pandemic on parents of kids with disabilities was particularly profound on mothers, because these are not kids that you could sort of put in a room at age 12 and say, do your work and I'll see you at 2:30. They really need constant supervision and help. And many of the moms in my practice had to leave their jobs because of this. Kids in private school had more options for in-person learning. Some kids did a hybrid model where they would be, home 3 days and in school 2 days. So it was all over the map, which does mean that when kids go back to school, that the kids in one classroom could be all over the map as well, which is going to be a real challenge for their teachers.
Let's look at some of the special issues that were particularly intense for this group of kids in the pandemic. And these are going to sound like issues that all children and all families faced, but they may have been particularly complicated and particularly difficult for the kids we're calling the quirky kids. So, for example, one of the things which all pediatricians everywhere are seeing are kids with disrupted sleep patterns, kids who are not on a regular sleep schedule anymore, or on a sleep schedule that had shifted to staying up very late, sleeping very late during the day. That's happened to a lot of kids. It can be particularly intense for this group of kids who do tend to settle into fairly rigid routines and sometimes have a lot of trouble making transitions.
I think, as we discuss in our book, quirky kids are more likely to have disrupted sleep and, eating issues and, with some nutritional issues on the basis of that. And I think all of we have seen this across the board in pediatric practice, disrupted sleep and eating and significant weight gain in a lot of kids. But for the quirky kids in particular, their routines are disrupted, and their parents are exhausted. They might have other kids in the family, and kids are sort of gradually staying up later and later, and that just doesn't bode well for being successful at school. We've seen a lot of kids with excessive weight gain in the last year, small kids gaining 35 to 50 pounds in a year. Less activity. Parents are afraid to go outside, like many of us are afraid to engage in activities that actually have traditionally been really helpful for their kids. Maybe it's a group at the YMCA, or it's a karate class, or whatever it is, and those things are not happening. And those things provide both social interaction and physical activity, which we know are really good for quirky kids. So I think that we've had a huge amount of increased screen time, and parents bringing that to our attention. Like, all he does is play video games. I can't get him out of his room. And we know that this has, gradually been a sort of huge problem for American childhood in general, but definitely for the quirky kids. They're very drawn to screens to a degree that can often be really unhealthy.
And just as parents everywhere have had to relax the rules a little bit around screen time, both to make family life work, but also to take cognizance of the fact that children are now learning in many cases on their screens. With quirky kids, you have a population of kids who maybe, given the choice, would have chosen virtual world over social interactions, which made them uncomfortable. And they've had a year now where, in some cases, that's kind of spiraled on and on. And of course, all of this is in the context of the stresses on families, the economic problems, the loss and grief that people have been going through. Again, issues for all children, but we want to concentrate on this particular population. And now we're talking about sending children back to school. And we want to talk about this population. And again, a lot of what we're saying is going to apply to all children, but we're going to try to aim it a little bit at the quirky kids.
I often say to parents in my office, parents of quirky kids, well, with a typically developing child, you might have to repeat something 100 times. And with your quirky kid, it's more like 1,000. You just have to repeat until the message gets across. And I think as we anticipate kids going back to school, in a matter of a couple of weeks in many communities, we have to think about, one, recognizing for all families that have, been through this past year and a half with a child with atypical development, it's been a very, very heavy load. Sleep disruption should be addressed before school starts, and it won't be easy, but I will usually tell parents, start cutting back by 15 minutes at a time. If your child goes to bed at midnight tonight, make it midnight, and then in 3 days, make it 11:45, and then in 3 more days, make it 11:30. Go, kind of gradually move back, and then get the child out of bed after a reasonable amount of hours of sleep in the morning, so that when the first day of school comes, you're not dragging a child that's, completely asleep to school. Think about the transition back to social life before school starts. If there's any opportunity to get together with a child from class, if you know the parents, if that's a doable thing, it might help relieve the anxiety that a child will feel about going back to school.
This is also a time to, as you're getting ready to go back to school and as the child goes back to school, to think about the child's mental health, to check in regularly and ask how the child is feeling, to find a language that works to talk about the way that the child is feeling and thinking. And one way to look at that is to think about what supports maybe were important to the child in the past. Is there a counselor? Is there another person who's been helpful? But the last piece that we want to talk about with quirky children, and it's something we come back to again and again in our book, is that finding the right program, the right educational setting, the right mix of help and therapies for a quirky child is always a work in progress. When you've found the right combination for this year, you've found the right combination for this year. So part of going back to school may be a chance to pick up what was helpful before, but part of going back to school may mean reevaluating where the child is and what the child needs, because that is always true with quirky kids. We ask different things of children as they grow. We ask different things of a 5-year-old and of a 7-year-old, and that brings out different strengths and weaknesses. And in these children who are not developing along the typical predictable track, that may mean new strengths, new weaknesses, new challenges, new needs for help, or maybe not needing some of the supports you needed before.
I think Perri mentioned the mental health piece, and I think it's worth saying that, we have a longstanding mental health crisis with regard to kids and adolescents in the United States, and it's gotten worse during the pandemic. And definitely the isolation that some kids have felt has caused increased levels of depression, anxiety, fear. Many kids have lost someone that they loved during the pandemic, and that will increase grief and anxiety. And I think just being cognizant of that, making sure teachers are aware before kids start school. If you have an email address for teachers saying, just so you know, my child's grandfather died of COVID during the pandemic, and it's been a very hard year, I think that would go a long way to having a child be treated sensitively by the people that are going to greet him when he goes back to school.
And as Eileen said earlier, teachers are going to have a real challenge. Kids are going to be coming back in at very different places. This is going to be a moment for tolerance. It's going to be a moment for not thinking in a perfectionist way about academic achievement, but really helping kids who have lost ground make it up in a non-judgmental way. It's a lot for teachers to do, and the more that you can fill the teacher in, help the teacher understand, work with the teacher, I think the better everyone's going to be. We're going to all need to support each other this fall. We thought we would give you a couple of specific cases, children we've made up or composite children. We're facing this situation and some ideas for how to help. And then we're going to come to some general issues and how you might address them. So here, Eileen, here's your first case.
Okay.
It's a 12-year-old girl with social anxiety and OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, who had more difficulty prior to the pandemic than during the pandemic because her OCD focused around issues of being late. And so during the pandemic, when her study was all remote, she actually loved it because she was always on time and never missed a class and could do all her work. And she's now extremely anxious about returning to school.
So, this, I have seen a few kids like this for whom, being in control of every minute of their day was really very satisfying to them, and way more girls than boys, by the way, I might add, especially about being on time and doing well in school. So how would we help a child like this? I think if you're not familiar with Carol Gray's social stories, I highly recommend that as a way of sort of narrating the transition back to school and, talking through, getting to school, getting there on time with the child so she kind of knows what to expect when she goes back. Let her teacher know and other important adults in the school know that this is her specific anxiety. Cognitive behavioral therapy has a very good track record for treating anxiety disorders, including obsessive compulsive disorder. And we're now looking at, a head-to-head study in our clinic about virtual versus in-person CBT. But there's definitely some evidence that virtual, sort of over a computer, cognitive behavioral therapy can really help. If it's possible to connect the child with a friend before she starts school, so there's a familiar face, that I think would be helpful for most kids. And then kids need to know, who are the friendly adults in their world at school? Not just their teacher, but is it a therapist or the librarian, or who is it that this child can turn to if she's feeling distress? Many kids, and this child included, will have some anxiety about COVID. And, we're hoping that everybody will mask up their kids when they go back to school. But we expect kids, especially kids who have experienced COVID in their families, will have a lot of anxiety about being in a room with, 25 other kids at the same time. And finally, of course, If the child is 12 or over, the child should be vaccinated and every single member of the family should be vaccinated.
So here's a second case. Here's a 10-year-old boy with ADHD and some learning issues whose friends are all video game friends and who over the course of the pandemic has become very dysregulated with respect to sleep, to eating, and to learning, and has not been able to focus on remote learning.
So I've seen a lot of these kids in practice this year who their default is video games, and their parents are tearing their hair out trying to figure out what to do. And so I usually recommend that they really do develop some a narrative with their child about the benefits and the risks of constant video gaming, and making some rules about screens. No screens at meals, no screens after an hour and a half before you go to bed. We're going to lock them up. This child has ADHD. Some parents in my practice stopped their kids' ADHD medicine during the pandemic because they weren't in school. They didn't think they needed it. Well, they're going to need it now when they go back to school, and the expectations are changing. If a child has gained a significant amount of weight, they might need a different dose. And I think that's, the ADHD meds in particular are often shifting doses or shifting preparations to help a child as the demands on his learning and attention change. Again, the sleep schedule, anticipate it, start now so that it's easier. The whole family probably needs to adjust to getting ready for the back to school. And I do tell every parent in my office, especially right now, get outside every single day. One interesting thing we've noticed in our clinic is dramatically low levels of vitamin D in our patients because they're not getting any vitamin D from the sunlight because they're not going outside. And so I think it's a really important thing to mention to parents, like outside physical activity is really, really good for kids, not just because of vitamin D. And any social activity that the child could engage in that does not involve a video game, I would recommend.
And we'll come back to this again and again. There's a relationship here between the sleep schedule and the screen time. And we're going to say this again and again because it's such a huge issue for so many families. If screens have sneaked into that child's bedroom or into that child's bedtime during the pandemic, it's time to get them out. It's time to get them out of the hour and a half, 2 hours before sleep. It's time to get them out of the bedroom. It'll help with sleep and it'll help with more. And it's going to be something that has to happen gradually, probably, and it's going to take work. So here's a third case, a 6-year-old with autism spectrum disorder who missed a year of kindergarten and the services that would have been delivered in kindergarten. At the same time, the family was under economic stress, a single mom who lost her job during the pandemic, who is home full-time with the 6-year-old and his sister, who's been doing remote learning. Family's under stress, sister can't concentrate because the 6-year-old is disrupting her ability to learn remotely. Sleep is very disrupted. The mom's depressed and feeling very isolated.
So in a situation like this, and this is not that uncommon. I think mothers in particular have just really had a lot of stress in the last year. So my first recommendation for this mom would be get a therapist for yourself, because you need someone to process this past year and a half with, who can, who's all about you and not all about your kids. So that, if you take care of yourself, you can take care of them better. And so I do think just sheer recognition of how challenging this past year has been is really important. Probably the number one thing for this child is structure, structure, structure. The number 1, 2, and 3 things is, if he had been in kindergarten this year, they would have a posted schedule on an easel somewhere in the room saying, we do this at 8, this at 8:15, this at 8:30, and like sticking to a structure that is very comforting to kids in general, especially kids who are sort of rigid in their thinking and not very flexible. I think that is a really important thing. And I think before he starts school, it's probably worth reevaluating him because he missed his whole first year of school and services, and getting him reevaluated by the special education team might really help. If he's a child that really cannot fall asleep easily, maybe he's a candidate for melatonin. This is not a moment for perfectionism. This is a moment for kind of making it through the day and making it as good as it can possibly be. But this is a really challenging thing. And the 10-year-old sister needs some attention also, because this is a very stressful thing for the sibling of a quirky kid who kind of can't get her own work done because she's constantly distracted. So I think making sure the school knows how difficult the year has been for both kids and their mother, and pulling out all the stops to make sure everybody's getting their needs addressed is critical.
We have a 14-year-old girl who has both social anxiety and a mood disorder, and who has generally done very, very well in school, but found remote learning very challenging and missed her community of friends who were based at school. She started restricting her food intake and was actually diagnosed with anorexia nervosa and hospitalized, which is something that we're actually seeing a lot of.
Yeah, for reasons that are not well understood, there has been a sharp increase in eating disorders during the pandemic, and including in populations that have not traditionally seen kids with restricted eating. So this girl was always a perfectionist, and I think that the pandemic took a huge toll on her, and this is how it manifested itself. And so for her to go back to school in the fall is going to be really, really challenging. So I think obviously the most important thing is nutrition and mental health support, engaging her parents so that they can support her recovery, and anticipate back to school conversations with teachers and with friends. A child like this is going to be very worried about lost academics, and I've had lots of conversations with older school age kids and high schoolers who are very worried that this is going to affect their future, their academic future, because they have lost important academic time. The parent should absolutely meet with the school nurse and whatever kind of student support team there is in place for the school. And this might be a child who never before needed an IEP, but might need an IEP now, because you can have an IEP for social and emotional reasons, as well as for learning disabilities or developmental disabilities. And she may be a child who would really benefit from that.
And our last case is a 9-year-old boy with ADHD who's fascinated with animation technology, who has sensory issues around clothing, around food, around noise. And he was home all year, and he really struggled with remote learning because of those attention issues, but he was able to work on his special interest, his animation. He was isolated from his friends. He was afraid to go out of the house because he was worried about COVID and infection.
So many of the things that we've already discussed for other kids would apply to this child as well, like outdoor activities with masks on as much as possible, connecting him with friends that he knows from school, a meeting with his teacher very early in the year, adjusting his IEP to address these kind of rather new issues. And a child like this is very likely to be on medications. And so a med check is in order, and just making sure that all members of his team are informed that he's coming back and what his struggles have been and what they're likely to be when he gets back to school.
Having gone through these cases, we're now going to sort out some of the issues which have come up in some cases repeatedly in talking about these kids, and try to offer some help and some guidelines for parents who have children facing questions like anxiety. And we've tried to work in answers to some of the questions which people attending the webinar sent in. We have to say, of course, that we can't tell anybody what to do with a specific child we've never seen, but we've tried to pull out some general principles which may be helpful to parents of quirky kids. And let's start with a word that you've heard us use repeatedly in talking about the children we just talked about, and really a word which applies to parents as well, and to pediatricians and to everyone right now, which is let's talk about anxiety. And this is an extremely anxious time for everyone. Children may be anxious about going back to school. Parents are certainly anxious about their children going back to school. Pediatricians are anxious about our patients going back to school. And in that connection, though, we're talking about a group of kids who are prone to anxiety, sometimes to the extent that it really gets in their way.
You know, anxiety is the most common mental health diagnosis in childhood, even among typically developing children. And it's certainly very, very common in the population of quirky kids. We've talked a lot about social anxiety and OCD. I am seeing more separation anxiety in kids who have been sort of cozily home with their parents and siblings during this past year and a half and are now anxious about separating, anxious about something happening to their family. COVID anxiety itself can be a manifestation of OCD or just general anxiety. We've already talked about cognitive behavioral therapy. Anxiety is very amenable to treatment, and it's really, really worth exploring that because I just think, I mean, I've seen so many kids really get so much better with good therapy. I love social stories as a way of narrating the day or a particular event, a birthday party, or dropping off, or even talking to the teacher together. We're going to draw a little cartoon. This is how it's going to go. And she might say this and she might say that. And let's think about how we would respond to those things.
So let's talk about COVID. And a couple of things have already come up. Let's start with, we're pediatricians. The first thing we're going to say, any eligible child, 12 and up, should be vaccinated. And family members, adult family members, contacts, grandparents, everyone, the children who are at this point still too young to be vaccinated, we want to surround them with vaccinated adults, with vaccinated family members. And can't say that too many times. And as Eileen said, we're hoping the American Academy of Pediatrics is strongly recommending that everyone in school should be masked. Children above the age of 2 and adolescents who are old enough to be vaccinated and are vaccinated, and teachers, everyone should be vaccinated, and we should be helping kids understand that that keeps them safe.
It is a moment in our clinics for both of us where every fever and respiratory illness has to be evaluated because any runny nose right now could be COVID. And our clinic is absolutely full of kids with respiratory viral illnesses. In Boston, at least the vast majority of them are not COVID so far. But we just are going to have to, everyone's going to have to do a lot of testing. We've already mentioned that some kids have suffered losses in the past year. Quirky kids are the most likely to know the rules and may be very anxious when they're not followed because they tend to be rule followers. Recommend to the child, care for yourself, don't correct other kids, bring any concerns you have about masking or not washing hands or touching things to a responsible adult. Don't be the COVID police for your classmates. And I think as family members and professionals, we have to be careful not to increase people's anxiety. Think about age-appropriate explanations for COVID, what it is, what it can do, and how we can protect ourselves.
And what we need to do is present the masks, present the vaccinations, present the hand hygiene as things that kids can do, ways that they can feel a sense of agency, ways they can keep themselves safer. And going back to what Eileen was saying about all those colds and respiratory illnesses, that hand hygiene, those masks, that's going to help not just lower the probability of COVID transmission, but it's going to lower the probability that a child's going to get any one of those respiratory viruses, which this year is going to have to be evaluated in the clinic, evaluated in the emergency room, all the places that you're hoping not to be. So let's talk in particular about wearing masks.
So, it has been my experience in my incredibly busy clinic that kids are amazingly good at wearing masks. Like, I cannot believe that a 2-year-old will wear a mask, but they often will. And they come in and they won't take them off. And, they like them if they have Mickey Mouse or, kind of fun designs on them. But, everybody should have lots of masks in their house and ones that fit well. Just normalize it as much as possible. Try not to complain about wearing a mask. I know it's kind of a pain in the rear, but it's, we all got to do it. And we should not complain about it in front of our kids. We've already said the AAP recommends masking for all school-age kids and staff and faculty at school, and engage any local pediatrician in your community to support this.
One of the things that's going to come up for a lot of these kids then as they come back to school is the issue of time management and executive function, because these are struggles for a lot of quirky kids. Many of them can do details, can do specific questions, but they tend to miss the forest. And they tend to have a lot of trouble with the larger question and the larger project. And one of the things which is going to come back, which has been a traditional difficulty for quirky kids, is homework. And not only being in school with the various kinds of stresses and anxieties and worries that come with going back to school, but then having to come home and manage your time at home.
I think a lot of quirky kids use a lot of energy making it through the day. I think they just have to work harder at a typical school day than a more neurotypical child. And they're tired when they get home. And the idea that now they have to spend an hour or two doing more work is just overwhelming for a lot of quirky kids. I kind of hate homework, especially in the elementary school years. I really think that, kids ought to be playing and engaging socially with each other, and that's way more important than any math problems they're going to do when they're in fourth grade. But I don't run the educational system in the United States. If a school is willing to adjust a homework load for a child, I'm in favor of that. I think anything to reduce stress and anxiety about academic performance is well worth the effort.
I think that if you want to actually formally approach the school, as Eileen says, even review the IEP, that's very valuable. But I also think that going back to some of the old things we used to advise, set up a special place and time for homework. Find a place where the most difficult distractions are going to be minimized. Break it into small chunks. Go over it with the child in advance and don't get to the end of the designated homework hour only to discover that the big project hasn't been touched. And we're all capable of doing this ourselves.
In our own lives.
In our own lives. But this is a time to sort of help the child solve this, provide small breaks, small treats, small rewards, and again, factor it into that sleep issue, because you're trying to reset a clock and you don't want a child who's pushing back against the limits of how late they can stay awake to find themselves in school the next morning completely exhausted.
Let's talk about social life, both for young kids and for older kids, which, as we know, can be a major stumbling block for quirky kids. And as kids anticipate going back to school and the social demands on their time, that can, of course, make life more difficult for everybody. So we suggest practicing with kids, getting together with other kids prior to the start of school, using social stories, anticipate the predictably difficult times. Like, does your child have trouble with transitions or drop off? Some kids have more trouble with pickup because they've gotten engaged in an activity and they don't want to leave. So anticipating those things, talking to your child about what it means to be flexible and how important it is that we have to flex as demands change. Who to text or call if a child needs help with a homework assignment after school or on the weekends. And some schools have instituted buddy systems for quirky kids so that they're assigned to kind of, an alpha child in the classroom who, for whom this is like a little bit of a responsibility and recognition of their ability to do this sort of thing, and to help a quirky kid kind of manage the social world of school.
And complicated as it can be to try to help manage a younger child's social life, it gets more complicated as they get older. And, in all of the things that we're talking about, we this year have the complexity of, can this happen safely? And with younger children, you can arrange those visits before school starts, and you can make sure that they're outside, that they're distanced, that they're masked, that you're talking with other families about what you're comfortable with. Older kids, it's a little more of a challenge. And for parents of quirky kids, it's something where they usually have to stay engaged more completely and longer than other parents.
Right. I mean, I often say to parents, when kids are in elementary school and to some degree in middle school, you're kind of in charge of creating a social life for them. And I had a teenager recently say to me, I miss being a kid. And I think what he really meant by that was, I miss the fact that I had a social life because my parents arranged it for me and I really enjoyed it. And now they can't do that anymore. And so, a lot of quirky kids have special interests or special splinter skills that they can do that other kids can't or aren't interested in. And that is often a way to create a social world for a child. They're really good at music, they have perfect pitch, or they're math, geniuses, or they have a special interest that's, other kids might have too, sports statistics or the weather or the Civil War, something that, they're engaged and passionate about, and that can help them engage in a community. A lot of kids will do community service projects, at work at a food pantry or a homeless shelter, or volunteer at the YMCA, that kind of thing that can create a social interaction for them with other kids. If they have an opportunity to get together with another teenager before school, great idea. Do they need a therapist? I think many kids towards middle school and early high school that are, under the Quirky Kids umbrella do develop some mood disorders because they start kind of having an appreciation of how different they are than other kids, and often will really benefit from an opportunity to talk it over.
And one of the pieces of advice which we've been giving through the pandemic and we're still giving, and it's really important to remember, is keep checking in, keep asking. Even if you're asking the teenager who doesn't seem thrilled that you're asking, you don't have to ask. Checking in doesn't mean that you have to ask, in a profoundly sensitive way, what are the big issues? It just means asking, what was your day like? What was something good that happened today? Was there anything, it means being willing to keep checking in, to keep asking, even more than you usually should, on your child's mood and on how things are going in this unusual fall. And then finally, let's talk about sensory issues, and then we'll go over some general principles for back to school. But sensory issues are common to these kids. A lot of them have problems with noise that doesn't bother other kids, with clothing, with labels, with textures, with touching the Play-Doh, or with certain foods, or with the squeaky chalk on the blackboard.
I've been hearing a lot this year about misophonia, which is a term that wasn't even familiar to me a couple of years ago, but kids who have trouble listening to another person eat or chew their food. Physical proximity, like understanding like how close should you be to another person, or should they be to you? So prepare in advance, like think about, like put on some we've all been living in sweatpants for a year and a half, right? So, putting kids in real clothes and socks and shoes and seeing what that feels like for a few days. Is this a child that's been using noise canceling headphones, which I think 5 years ago people thought looked weird, and now everybody walks down the street with them, so it's not so weird anymore. Fidget toys for kids who need something to do with their hands, something to keep in their pocket, and developing a signal with a teacher. You touch your nose or you scratch your head or something that indicates that you're feeling overstimulated and you need a break.
So let's finish then by coming back to some general principles for going back to school in this strange year. Being in touch with your child's teacher and the larger support team that Eileen has talked about that's there for your child. So your child knows who they are, so they know who your child is and how your child did over the past year, both in terms of academics and in terms of social life.
Make sure the teachers know if there were any losses or bad outcomes, or if there was any other major change in your family over the past year. For example, a divorce or a new baby, or somebody moved into your house or moved out of your house. And just expect that not everybody is going to interpret the guidelines around COVID the same way that we do. And finally, and critically, we recommend vaccines and masks for everybody right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klass and Dr. Costello, for all that great information. Just a reminder to everyone that uh, that you can register on healthychildren.org to receive our e-newsletter, a personalized homepage, and special offers. And don't forget to follow healthychildren.org on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We've drawn the names of the 10 winners of copies of Quirky Kids, and we've included those names in the chat box now. Congratulations, everyone. If you were not a winner, you can always pick up a copy of this amazing book wherever books are sold. Thank you again for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Keep an eye out for a quick survey and please let us know what you thought of today's webinar. Have a great rest of your day and thanks again.